I think she just has like a line of fans that are like right at the front of the stage that no one can see. She's like, no matter where I am, this hair will blow.
Yeah, right.
Yes.
Whereas Adele, I was looking at her and she said, like, Beyonce, here's my fan. It was literally right in front of her. She was like, I get what?
She's like, here it is.
So relatable.
This regular old fan. I'm an accidental social worker. So when I graduated undergrad, I knew that working at a store in the mall was not going to be enough for me to sustain myself independently. And so I remember my dad was friends with a lady who worked in Frankfurt. And she worked in I think she was the governor's assistant or something like that. And so he asked her, like, how do you get on with the government? And so she said that I just needed to come down there and apply for some jobs, which I did. I applied for a family services worker, which is like a CPA, a child protection worker. I had no idea what it was. I had 2 interviews on the same day for the same position. And the first lady had to explain to me what the job was, and I was like, does it come with insurance? Yeah. How much does it pay? $16,404 in 1994. And I was like, that's a ton of money. I can totally do this. And so next thing you know, I go to the second interview and I'm much more well-versed, so I just repeated what the lady said in the first interview, and so I got the job. And I'm an accidental social worker. Currently, I serve as the Bias Incident Response Coordinator for the University of Kentucky, and those services are housed here at the Violence Intervention and Prevention Center. So my role on campus is to provide support and advocacy for anybody, any students, staff, or faculty that have been impacted by racism, bias, hatred, identity-based violence, anything like that. And we know very well that happens on a pretty fairly basis on this campus, but our campus isn't any different than any other campus. So these instances happen, but we're just making a much more targeted effort to support the people who have been impacted, because we know there's trauma that comes from that. Much like there's trauma that comes from interpersonal violence, there's trauma that comes from identity-based violence. And so the university committed to providing the resources to support people impacted. And we also started our Bias Incident Response Team this semester. And so that is the university's official reporting structure for instances of bias, hatred, racism, and identity-based violence. And so I've been doing this I've been working on this for about a year or so. Prior to that, I was the social justice educator here at the VIP Center. And so doing a lot of programming around social justice issues, making sure that marginalized communities are connected to the VIP Center, because marginalized communities experience interpersonal violence at higher rates. So it was really, really important that they are connected here. Prior to that, I essentially spent almost 20 years in the child welfare arena, which is a really long time. And you don't find very many people who typically stay that long in it for lots of reasons. But I started out as a family services worker here in Fayette County, then moved to the training component of child welfare in this state. And then from there, just kind of bounced around a little bit. I've done a lot of things in child welfare. I've done ongoing services, I have done policy work, done program development. I facilitated family team meetings for 8 years, and I saw all kinds of things. In those 8 years, we almost did 4,000 meetings. It's a lot of people to see, and it's a lot of secondary trauma to experience. And so working in child welfare has been great. It was great. That was my training ground. That's how I learned how systems function. That's where I learned how systems show up in the lives of people, and how if a system doesn't work for a particular population of folks, kind of how that plays out. And so it was a great learning experience. I never expected to be a social worker, but I can't imagine doing anything else. What I really really like about it is the ability to be able to impact people that you will never know. And so like when you're doing macro level social work and looking at systems, you will have an impact. But the person that's going to be impacted isn't going to come up to you and be like, I'm so glad you wrote that policy for us. Thank you. That's not how that really works. But just knowing that you are in a position to be able to influence and change systems is a very, very powerful thing. Seeing people succeed. In child welfare, that was a really, really important thing for me to be able to see, and I think that's probably why I stayed so long, is because I would see, reunification happen. I would see a parent finish rehab and be able to go out and get a job. I would see, families be able to get everything back together and their children thrive. I mean, former foster kids that I've had, I see them now. One in particular, I was at her wedding. And she's doing beautifully. So when things work, when families heal, when people are being able to meet their needs, that's the stuff that keeps me energized about this work, because I know it's important, I know it's needed, and I know how much change social workers can bring to people's individual lives, to families, to communities. And to me, it's a gift to be able to do that, to be involved in that. What's difficult about social work? Good God. I think for me, I struggle with bureaucracy and red tape, because I have seen enough times what that does to families and how that damages people, how it hurts children, all kinds of things. And so I'm just not that's not an area that I like to deal with. The bureaucracy for sure. I think in child welfare what was really difficult was the way that people view that work. If I had $1 for every time I got called a baby snatcher, I would have Oprah money. Like, I'd be a billionaire. I think social workers don't get enough credit for what it is that we do and the critical roles that we play, like in the education system or like in healthcare. We are an important part of how these places function, but I don't know that we always get the respect. I take that back. We don't always get the respect that we deserve. The other thing that is really difficult about this work is secondary trauma. And especially when you're working with people who are in their own trauma, naturally some of that, you're going to carry some of it. I didn't know anything about secondary trauma until I was maybe 15 years into the field, because no one was really talking about it. But once I realized what it was, I was like, that's totally what I've got. And that's really hard to navigate through if you're not real intentional with taking care of yourself. And so for me, those are the kind of things that were the most difficult and still are the most difficult. I talk to people a lot. I talk a lot. And I've been really fortunate to be in spaces where other folks recognize secondary trauma, and so we were able to support each other. I have a beautiful, beautiful team of supportive women in my life that I know that I can call at any point in time and just be like, girl, guess what happened? And I'm like, girl, that's so messed up. Are you okay? And like, they make you feel better, But I also work out because I think expending that physical energy is really helpful for me. Other people like read books, they do coloring books. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff that folks do. But for me, those are the things that work the best. But I was not always in tune with self-care. And so now I realize exactly how important it is. And for any social worker, no matter what part of this field you're going into, you have to go into it with a plan for that. That's not something you want to plan after you're already, in a ton of trauma. I think for folks who intentionally pick social work, you have to be really, really clear on why you're doing it. And if you're doing it to address some of your own stuff, Because I've worked with people who've been in child welfare and wanted to save kids because no one was able to save them. I think you really have to be clear on what your motivation is. And you also have to recognize that you're not going to be able to save everybody. You cannot go into this field or any field of helping people through whatever trauma and troubles that they have. You can't enter this work thinking, I'm going to be the one who's going to save everybody. If you can have a positive influence on one person's life, then to me, you've been really successful. But I think knowing those things and also recognize you're not going to get rich. It's just like this isn't a field where people are compensated for what they're worth. And so people just think, oh, well, just social workers. No, we're more than social workers. We are often counselors, therapists, lawyers, babysitters, all kinds of things. And so I think for me, not ever knowing anything about social work, I don't know that if I would have necessarily picked this for myself, because I was a justice administration major. I was gonna be a parole officer, and that's not really a social worky kind of thing. It's pretty punitive. And so I don't know if I necessarily would have picked this. But I think social work picked me, is what happened. And I'm glad that it did. But I also recognize that there's been some bumps along the way for me, because I didn't think about those things I just said. I didn't think about why I was doing it. I didn't think about, I thought I was going to come in and save, let me put my superhero cape on and I'm just going to save this whole family. And that's just not how it works out. My favorite quote is, well-behaved women rarely make history. And I feel like that speaks to me so much, because when you're trying to push back against systems and bureaucracy that you know is causing harm to people, as a woman in this work and as a queer woman of color in this work, I recognize how I show up and how I have to show up. And I'm not always well behaved by other people's standards. But I think when you're trying to do what is right and what is best for people, you have to push, and that's just part of it. And so when I first heard that quote, I was like, that is my life story. That is it. And so if I happen to make some sort of history, it is because I was not well behaved in doing whatever it was that made me historic. And I'm okay with that. I'm totally okay with that.